First Responders Network. I'm Crystal Bailey, live from IACP in Dallas. Now, we've been talking a lot about the Moonshot goal, and one of the most important aspects of that goal is training. It's a massive discussion across the country. We have an app for everything, so why don't we have better training, better technology, right? Well, I have here Chief Jim Blocker from Michigan, Battle Creek, Michigan,
That's
Cereal
right.
City, right?
That's right.
And you're here to talk to us about the training that you've taken part with Axon.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about your search for VR training specifically.
Well, it was a few years ago that I knew that VR training is about decision making. And you can take someone out to the range, you can put them through multiple iterations of training on how to use a piece of equipment, but the one thing you struggle with is when to decide to actually use it. And in Michigan, we're not all weather all the time. And so the virtual training opportunity, I saw the technology about, 4 years ago at one of these conferences. I said, it's good. It's got a lot of promise. But I don't think it was quite yet there. And I'm pretty confident Axon thought the same thing.
Yeah.
And so as the technology improved, we started to see there's a real opportunity to have a piece of product that will help us year-round, even in Michigan, train and help officers make better decisions on the fly. And that's really key.
And you went on this search. You mentioned you were at ICP. You went on the search for the last few years to find that?
That's right. So there was other technology out there, and that's really good. I was restrained, or the planning constraint for me was this. We looked at one system where they had multiple screens and you could walk into a room. Well, I had just built a brand new building, and the one room that we had left that I was going to put this in was our defensive tactics room. It's all padded. And so I brought it up to our training unit. I just about had a revolt on my hands. I mean,
really?
It was very clear. The officers love their combatives room, their defensive tactics room, their padded room where they could get together and wrestle and do whatever it is that they were doing. And it's all very good.
Yes.
And so I realized, okay, that's no longer an option. So what else is out there? And I thought, well, certainly this system is out there. And we took a second look at it.
So tell me a little bit about how long you've been using VR training and the effect it has had on your police officers.
So we've had the system. I'm certainly well prepared to be corrected. About 10 months now.
Okay.
We've had a lot of discussions on training and decision making, but this particular system, about 10 months. And I can give you an example of how well it has worked for us.
Please do.
So we had a young man. He was in the middle of an intersection. He was swinging a bat wildly. Didn't have a shirt on. Of course, the 911 call is there's a man and he is about to kill somebody. That's the initial call. Dispatch automatically sends two officers. Right as they're rolling, they're thinking like all our officers are doing tactically. How do I respond? Lights are on. Siren is gone. Adrenaline is pumping. They're heading to the scene with supporting officers as well. They arrive, and immediately, though, the one officer had training in crisis intervention training, mental health awareness training. That's more in depth than a lot of mental health training. And he quickly was able to pick up on those physical cues that existed and were being demonstrated by this young man.
Okay.
Turns out he's an 18-year-old autistic kid, and he was swinging that bat. And officers immediately shut down the sirens, turned off the lights, and they made the great decisions. Mom ended up showing up, and that's a success story. And the reason it's a success story is what virtual training does for us, it gives us that opportunity to teach officers sooner in their career, give them a vast number of experiences so they can live them, train in them, and then when it really happens, it's there. It's in the inventory, then kind of pull it out of the air and act.
Right.
And that's really key.
Yeah, and imagine that there are oftentimes mental health perpetrators or suspects that really just needed to be taken care of in that moment.
There is not one single study out there yet that has accurately depicted how many calls for service where mental illness has an impact, right? But it's been estimated 20-25%, perhaps even more. So 1 out of 4, right, calls
Wow.
are impacted by some sort of mental health reaction, whether it's the onset of mental illness or a known mental illness. And I think that's critical. We didn't ask to be involved in dealing with the mentally ill,
Right.
but we have had to. And so we have to adapt. So we
Yes.
got to respond to that if we want to be professional.
And I think there's another element of that is that there's an increasing homeless population. People who struggle with homelessness sometimes also have mental health issues.
Yep.
So would you say this VR training kind of helps officers navigate
It
some of
does.
those scenarios that could be really eliminating some escalation?
Yeah, I think it helps you better train and be better prepared to deal with all scenarios in a tactical way with a higher level of tactical readiness, but where it's not so obvious that you're ready to act. And I think that's important. It's an important cue. We're a very visual and almost emotional culture right now,
Yes.
for whatever reason. And I think those are just subtle things that we need to pick up on as a profession and get better at, but still give us that high level of preparedness that we need on a daily basis.
And one of the things that you've shared with me before, when we were speaking the first time, is that this situation with this autistic teen, it was not policy for the lights to go off and Can you talk a little bit about that? That it was actually against protocol.
Well, that's the hard part. It wasn't in a tactical scenario. Matter of fact, it is policy. If you're going to drive, in an emergency response, you have to have an
Lights
audible
on,
signal.
right?
You
Yeah.
have to have lights on. But then we jump to another policy when the situation on the ground changes and we now know more. And it's a great example where, yes, let's say it's a true assault. And let's say it's an assault in progress. Yeah, that's going to be a far more tactical and kinetic response. But this wasn't. This was a medical emergency that looked like it was a crime in progress. And it's those subtle changes and cues that officers have to pick up on. We're not going to get it right every time. We know that. But if I can bring in product to help young officers become more experienced and experience more things and develop a better response bandwidth, if you will, then I'm going to do it. Because they don't have the amount of time to learn and train and make mistakes that I had when I was a young officer. Because their video recorded everything on their body, in their car.
Right.
So we have to do what we can to make sure they're prepared.
And it requires a little extra thinking, more cognitive thinking, and it's situational. And that's very difficult, I can imagine.
Yeah, try thinking critically in the middle of a chaotic,
Yes.
sudden, traumatic moment. Where, by the way, the officer also is a part of that moment too. We hire from the human race, not the superhuman race, and we have to recognize I got to do what I can as a leader to prepare our folks to respond.
And also keep them safe.
Absolutely.
Now, talk to me a little bit about the emotional reaction that could have been had if that situation with that teen had been different.
We'd be reading about it on CNN. Truly, we can mention multiple events that made the news where officers responded, weren't aware of the cues, weren't aware of the history, weren't aware of the person's cognitive decline, responded with deadly force, and based on what they knew at the time, it was justified. But that doesn't fix how they feel an hour later when they realize what happened.
Right.
That's the part of the story we don't ever hear.
Yes.
Those officers are horrifically traumatized because they responded, but later they're in shock because they didn't know.
Hindsight's
And,
2020.
and had they known what they knew at that moment after the incident, clearly they would have made better decisions. But that's the whole point. You got to give folks this opportunity, the folks that are responding. When you go to an emergency room and you have an injury, do you want the new guy? Or do you want the one that's been there and done it and understands it? Well, that's where we've got to get our officers. We got to get them get rid of that new guy shell almost as quickly, or new officer, new woman, whatever.
Right.
We have to get them ready. And that's critical. And as a leader, that's why we're doing it. That's why we're looking for products like this to better prepare our force.
It's really interesting, this human element that you've provided, because like you mentioned, it doesn't get talked about, but the devastation that would have occurred that day would have been on behalf of the family and the first responders.
It would have pinged the nation
Yes.
by way of the media. And it would have been a fascinating story. There would have been a lot of reaction to it. And once again, a lot of question of, well, why? Why did it happen? Why did it happen? And not that it won't, not that it can't, but again, whatever we can do to make us respond better, that's what we have to do.
It's a matter of having the right resources,
Absolutely.
the better technology, the training. Now, as far as this is very clearly an advantage. The
Yeah.
example that you've given. What are some of the advantages overall that you can say? You mentioned the body camera footage. There's a level of scrutiny now. You
Yeah.
have to be performing at a particular capacity.
That's
Can
right.
you talk a little bit about how this is an advantage to law enforcement? Because sometimes there's some negative feedback, but talk about the advantages of having this technology.
So what's really helpful with this technology is the fact that I can use it almost anywhere. I can pick it up and move it almost anywhere in my facility. That's helpful. I don't need a dedicated space just for this one thing. Two, I know certainly currently we are really appreciating getting different scenarios because that adds a level of dynamic and change that we need in any training environment. The biggest challenge for our SWAT team, any SWAT team, is that you can't keep training in the same location because now you're starting to cheat. You already know the answer to the test,
yeah.
right? And so what we do is we try to change it up, but it's still the same facility. Well, that's what's really helpful and we appreciate is the fact that I can use it anywhere. We can use it in a relatively short period of time, almost on a daily basis, and we get new scenarios, if you will, or incidents. And that's good because no one becomes proficient at one thing. And we can constantly hone in and build and increase that level of skill set that we're looking for.
So clearly this is, creating better interactions with the community, which is obviously a win for everybody. I know that when you first sat down, you shared that there was a little bit of resistance. Is that right?
Well, yeah. Well, the resistance it wasn't to the virtual training. It was the fact that I know that there are really good systems out there. But they require to be set in one spot.
I see.
To be calibrated, and that's where they sit. Well, that was a constraint for me. I couldn't do that. But and I know those are good systems. But this gives us a level of, utility and creativity that we can actually use this anywhere. Whether it's in the padded room, whether it's in our training room, whether it's in the community room, I got all kinds of places I can use it.
That's because you're talking about the goggles.
Yeah, it's portable. We can use it anywhere.
Right.
We don't have to, bolt systems down to a floor.
Yes.
If we need to move it to the academy for a week, we can do that.
Stick it in a backpack.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
So tying this back to Axon's Moonshot goal of cutting all gun-related deaths by 50% between the police and the public in 10 years, I'd love to hear how you think this is part of that solution. Long term, is this possible? Is this doable? Can we do this with this technology?
I think one thing I know is that I think the combination of great training, great response training, with the evolution of AI and more realistic training on the tech side, I think those create a benefit, a classroom for officers to experience about as real time as they can. And the more they can experience in terms of traumatic incidents where they have to react in moments, I think it's the difference between life and death. Use of force against the innocent or those that are unhealthy, cognitively or otherwise, versus those that it truly is a kinetic, malevolent actor.
Right.
And that's true for the officers too.
Yes.
I mean, this goes both ways. You don't want a hesitant officer in one of those scenarios where they can't be hesitant. But at the same time, you don't want a scenario where the officer also has to deal with the fact they had to use force on someone who is cognitively impaired or had the onset of a mental health episode.
Right.
They're all equally traumatic, and that's where tech helps us get better.
Well, I appreciate your time. I'm grateful
Thanks
that
for
it's
having
already
me.
created positive solutions for you in Battle Creek. And I look forward to seeing as many of those positive stories as possible. We're here at FRN where we can share that. You mentioned some of those negative stories, how they would get the headlines. FRN is a place where we can share the good stories.
Right.
So if that continues to happen in Battle Creek, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm glad to share.
Absolutely. And stay with us on FRN. We'll have more positive and amazing stories from chiefs across the nation. Thank you for your time.